Picture this. It's the year 985, and you are literally in the middle of the North Atlantic. Waves the size of buildings are just crashing around you. There's frost on every single rope. And you're one of 32 men sitting in an open wooden boat. No cabin, no walls, no roof, and absolutely no fire. Not a single flame. You're about to spend weeks in an environment that honestly, by all biological metrics, should kill you. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're decoding one of the absolute most incredible feats of engineering in human history, the Viking survival system.
Now, to truly grasp what we're looking at here, we really have to understand the brutal stakes of this environment. Winter surface temperatures in these waters, they hover right around a deadly 2 degrees Celsius. The air temperature is literally freezing. And when you factor in a -20 wind chill out on the open ocean, it's an environment that violently assaults the human body. Exposed skin actually begins to suffer frostbite in under 10 minutes.
And if you fall into that 2-degree water, well, modern hypothermia research tells us you don't just slowly get cold. Your body completely shuts down. You lose consciousness in under 15 minutes. But look, even without falling in, just prolonged exposure to that sub-zero wind, draining your core temperature hour by hour on an open vessel, that will kill you. Survival just seems biologically impossible.
Which brings us to the ultimate, almost impossible question. How do 30 men survive for weeks on an open ocean in these conditions without a single fire? You might be thinking, just light a fire on the deck. But a longship is made of pine and oak. It's sealed with tarred animal hair, rigged with wool treated with animal fat, and it flexes with every single wave. One rolling ember, and the ship that is keeping you alive suddenly becomes a floating coffin. So no fire, they couldn't use it.
Okay, let's dive into this. To understand how they survived, we're going to peel back the layers of this incredible engineered survival system. First, the deadly open ocean. Then, engineers, not tough guys. Next, the ultimate wool system, followed by the ship as thermal armor, the 160-watt human heater, and finally, a massive survival network.
Moving to Section 2, Engineers, Not Tough Guys. Dismantling the Hollywood Myth.
So, there's this really popular image of Vikings as these hard, primitive guys who just gutted it out, right? Just tough guys gritting their teeth and suffering through the freezing cold. But the archaeological reality proves the exact opposite, and it is genuinely fascinating. Every single element of their approach was calculated, deliberate survival engineering. They understood material insulation and thermodynamics centuries before science formally described it. They didn't just grit their teeth, they methodically engineered the cold entirely out of the equation.
Which brings us to Section 3, the ultimate wool system. Layer 1, skinned element defense.
Now, Viking Age wool was definitely not your soft modern sweater. They bred sheep with this incredible dual-coat fleece. So you had long, coarse hairs on the outside and then dense, really fine fibers on the inside. And here's the crucial part. They deliberately left the wool unwashed. Gross? Maybe. But genius? Absolutely. By rinsing it only in cold seawater, they preserved the natural hydrophobic lanolin oil straight from the sheep's skin. When woven into these tight diamond twill patterns, this stuff retained an astonishing 80% of its insulation capacity, even when it was completely soaking wet.
Let's actually see how this builds into a complete system. First, they wore a fine wool or linen inner layer to manage moisture. Next, a heavy wool tunic in the middle for core insulation. And finally, a thick outer shell cloak treated with tallow or beeswax to literally block the wind and water. It's crazy because if you walk into a high-end outdoor retailer right now, you are going to see this exact same 3-part system, inner moisture, middle insulation, outer shell, sold as modern, incredibly expensive lab-tested Gore-Tex for mountaineers. The Vikings literally engineered the exact same science 1,000 years ago just using sheep looms.
Next up is Section 4, the ship as thermal armor. Layer 2, the vessel.
Clothing is great, obviously, but you're still floating on a freezing ocean. Most people think of the ship just as a mode of transportation, completely missing the fact that it was actually thermal protection. Long ships used what's called clinker construction. This means each wooden plank overlapped the one below it, and they were riveted and sealed with tarred wool. Now, this wasn't just for riding crashing waves. That overlapping structure trapped minuscule, constant pockets of still air all along the interior of the hull. It effectively created a literal micro-layer of insulating air right between the crew and that freezing ocean.
And they didn't stop there. They manipulated the air above the deck, too. When conditions got rough, they didn't just sit there and suffer the wind. They would actually rig thick wadmal wool sailcloths straight across the midsection of the ship as a windbreak. And here's the kicker. Reducing wind speed across the human body by 50% effectively doubles the time before hypothermia sets in. They obviously didn't know the exact mathematical formula for this, but they absolutely knew the engineering principle. Block the wind, buy yourself time.
Now for Section 5, the 160-watt human heater. Layer 3, shared thermodynamics.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is we're moving into the most sophisticated and, honestly, human layer of the whole survival system. Viking crews were equipped with the standard gear called a hoodfat. These were essentially massive sleeping sacks made from walrus or seal hide with the insulating fur turned inward. Crucially, they were designed to be shared by 2 to 3 men at a time. The tough hide blocked the water and biting wind while the fur trapped the warmth. When you really think about it, the intimacy and the pure desperation of exhausted men crammed into a seal hide in the middle of a freezing ocean, it's staggering. But the real genius here, the heat source was the men themselves.
Let's break down the pure physics of this. A resting human body acts as a thermal engine, producing roughly 80 watts of energy. You put 2 men into one of these enclosed hide sacks, and boom, you suddenly have a 160-watt heater. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of a large, old-school incandescent light bulb burning inside a confined space the size of a coffin. Because the wind and water were totally blocked by the hide, the interior temperatures inside that sack could literally climb 15 to 20 degrees above the freezing air outside.
And they maximized this heat through just unbelievable efficiency. It was a perfectly timed thermodynamic engine. Think about it. A crewman pulling oars for hours builds extreme metabolic body heat. Then, when his shift ends, he climbs straight into the hoodfat, bringing all that blazing heat into the sack and keeping it warm. Meanwhile, the man who was resting takes his turn at the oars. So, no metabolic heat was ever wasted, and those sleeping sacks almost never went cold. Sure, it was cramped, damp, and probably smelled absolutely horrific, but hey, it kept them alive.
Let's zoom out to Section 6, a massive survival network. Layer 4. The macro logistics. Now, zooming out from the infamousy of the sleeping sack, the most impressive layer of all might just be that they engineered their entire route to minimize exposure in the first place. Archaeological surveys show over 200 harborage sites along just the Norwegian coast. I mean, think about that massive scale. Over 200 sites. These weren't just random spots they stumbled upon. They were calculated infrastructure, spaced roughly 1 day of sailing apart. Crews would beach their ships, light shore fires, eat hot food, and completely restore their core body temperatures before tackling the next leg. Plus, their route selection overwhelmingly favored the summer months, from May through August, when daylight was long and temperatures were actually survivable.
Looking at all this, we see a maritime infrastructure that Western Europe wouldn't even match for another 500 years. As the source material so perfectly puts it, and I absolutely love this quote, that's not survival instinct, that's the architecture of a civilization that understood the sea better than anyone on Earth. Seriously, they weren't just lucky survivors, they were brilliant, highly calculated engineers.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Every single system they built a millennium ago, from the dual-layer hydrophobic wool to the thermal air pockets in their hulls to the metabolic heat rotation, it is all completely backed up by modern science. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? 1,000 years ago, men crossed Arctic seas relying on engineered systems that still make total sense today. What modern technologies of ours will possibly last that long?